So, moving along, our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Gibson. Are you here, Stephen? Yes? From the UWA School of Design. And Stephen's talk is called Access to Open Space for Older Adults, Motivations for Visitation and Implications for Policy and Practice. So, which one will you use? This one. Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen. Over to you.
Thanks so much. So I think Stuart mentioned before that this was sort of along the lines of a TED Talk extravaganza or something. I was actually thinking more along the lines of a speed dating event, but 10 minutes is not a long time, so let's get right into this. A lot of what my research deals with is the practical applications of research. I've been a landscape architect and urban planning practitioner for about 25 years before I came into the academic world. So the research that I do has very practical applications. So we're going to be talking about the, excuse me, this thing's falling apart, the motivational side of what makes people use space and understanding that as the precursor to how to change design. So as far as the population is concerned, open space and parks are designed essentially for everybody. We have kids, we have 20-somethings on their skateboards, we have young families. All of these people use parks. So do older adults. But the difference here is that older adults use parks and open spaces very, very differently. And what that creates is a fairly massive divide between the way we design for the majority of the population and older adults. This is where this current research of mine that I'm going to share with you today comes in. Looking at the literature, I think Loretta actually touched on my first point here in a far nicer graphic representation that I'm doing right here, so thank you for that. But we know that there is an increase expected over the next 35 years. I think we're all here, we're all very much aware of that. I won't dwell on that point. One of the things that I've found in the literature which is really disturbing is that in relation to older adults, we have very limited knowledge of older adults with cognitive and emotional disabilities and their interaction with open space. Now, statistically and proportionately, there are quite a number, unfortunately, of older adults that do deal with dementia and Alzheimer's symptoms across a fairly large range. We know very little about how these people interact with these spaces. That's a problem. This is the one that really got me. Only 30 to 40% of people in this age group actually engage in 30 minutes of activity every day, which is something that medicine requires, or not requires, you can't require somebody to exercise, but recommends. And this is not just Australia, this is the US, this is Europe as well. My question from this is, what are the other 60 to 70% of people in this age group doing? Is it our designs in the built environment that are stopping them from wanting to use parks? I personally think a portion of it is exactly that issue. So it just reinforces that we know very little, and that's what my research is in the process of trying to address. So in summary, there are different patterns of use in open spaces across different age groups, but we don't have an understanding of the theory as to why the difference is there, and once we understand, we don't really comprehend how that can make a difference. So being the enthusiastic, excited researcher that I am, I came up with a theoretical framework. Isn't this good? This is what we've got to do. So what I realised was the framework has to help us understand why people experience open space differently and what motivates them to access and use it or not. Keep in mind the word motivation. That's the big point here. Fortunately, psychology, my new best friend, has done decades of research on motivation with people. And it shows quite clearly that people are motivated to do things that will fulfill their needs. I think we can all attest to that. Another fortunate thing out of psychology is this thing called self-determination theory. And these two guys, Rich Ryan and Ed Deasy, are the founders of this theory about 40 years ago, so they know what they're talking about. And what it basically says is that every single person, regardless of age, gender, culture or anything, have three needs. One of those is the need for autonomy. Autonomy is the ability for you to do something for yourself and by yourself without aid. The second need is confidence, feeling as though you can achieve, be successful in a task. Everybody wants that. And the last one is the most human of all, and that is relatedness. Our ability to do these things with others, to connect with others. And so quite simply, extrapolating from that, if it fulfills these needs, open space is going to be visited. Sounds like a fairly simple theory, doesn't it? How do we design spaces to make this happen? Well, I'm going to do you a favour. I'm not going to go into all of my data collection methodologies, all that sort of rubbish. We're going to get to the good stuff. The first thing that I confirmed with my research is that the importance of these three needs does indeed vary quite substantially by age. So we know that older adults have different needs than younger adults. It's very, very clear. Second thing is that the fulfilment of these three needs is both positively and significantly related to satisfaction, firstly with the park, but then the notion of revisiting that park a second time. This is what we want, is revisitation to occur. And then for the over 65 age group, this I found really interesting. The need for autonomy was the single most important need of these three. And I think we kind of touched on that in some of the previous presentations. What this means is that people over 65 want to be able to do things for themselves, and that is their primary goal. And I think we can all understand the reasons behind that. So now that all this information is there, what do we do with it? How do we get practical interventions, applications? I'm a landscape architect, this is what we do. So I'm going to give you a quick example of bench seating. In some of my interviews I conducted, there was a gentleman that said to me something along the lines of, I can't go to the park by myself because when I sit on a bench, I can't get out without help. And that's all about the design of the bench. So what this leads to is the fact that his need for autonomy is not met. And what happens there? He doesn't go to the park. So here he is, he's sitting in his bench seat, and this is actually the style of seat that he was talking about. I was in the retirement home interviewing him, and he pointed across the road at something like this. He's stuck in his seat, he can't get out, and he did tell me this story. He and his mates got caught and they had to wait for somebody to come past and rescue them. So what do we do? Well, this kind of seat creates a reclining posture, roughly about 15 degrees off vertical. This is the difficulty. It's a very simple fix. So what do? Well, we take the seat, we flatten it out a bit, lift it up, straighten the back, and all of a sudden we have a more upright posture. What does that mean? Well, it means that now I can go to the park by myself. If I can go to the park by myself, what happens? Need for autonomy is fulfilled, and the result of fulfillment of autonomy is this. This is what we're after. This is a very, very simple intervention, and this is just one of many. Another very quick example here. Shared use paths. We all know what they are. I'm sure we've all used them at our own risk and peril. We know what they look like, etc. We know the conflicts between pedestrians and bicycles. We know how dangerous they can become. We also know how fast cyclists travel on these paths. I'm a cyclist. I'm not picking on cyclists at all. It's about the use of and the respect for others. So what does all of this mean? Well, it comes up with a statistic, and it's this. 0%. Okay, what does that mean? Well, what this means is that 0% of the older adults that I interviewed had the confidence to be able to use shared use paths safely. It means that 0% of the older adults that I interviewed indicated that they had no autonomy because they couldn't do this by themselves. It was too dangerous. And that left 0% of the people that I spoke with said they would ever use a shared path because it is simply too dangerous. That leads to problems. So how do we find out what older adults need in a built environment? It's a very simple outcome. We ask a question. And that comes into the engagement process. Now, I know all of you guys are thinking, well, engagement takes time and it costs money. I was in practice, I know all about this. But when we consider the expanding population, percentage of the population, this is an investment in the future. When you look at it that way, it's not a massive amount of time or a massive amount of money to spend. It's important. So a colleague of mine that I was working with a number of years ago, and I developed a process of engagement. And this was actually initially put together for engagement with Indigenous populations, but it works identically well for older adults. It's a 4-step process. First step is understanding who you're engaging. This is before you even talk to people. This is simply learning who the people are, what their culture is, what their current capacity is. Second step is building a relationship, creating trust and opening channels of communication. If you don't do that, you don't get the truth. Third thing is the actual process of engagement itself. And that's making participants feel as though they have a voice, they have something to contribute. And then the actual facilitation itself, is once you've opened that floodgate of information coming from people, you've got to be able to guide it. This is not about us getting a bunch of people over 65 in a room for 5 minutes and saying, what do you think? Okay, now go away. This is about developing relationships. If you don't do that, you won't get to the core of what people need. So where I see this going with potential collaborations, there's 2 areas. One's practice-based, the other is research. So practice-based, I can see helping you guys with design guidelines, because that's what I used to do. Seminars on older adult engagement, review of any of the practices that you have. Be more than happy to help anybody with that kind of thing. There's also research-based. It's finding out a little bit more about the constituents you have in your locations. It's looking at, some of the practices you may have in engagement. How can they be aligned more to older adults? And then best practice review. I've spent a large part of my career in the US, so I'm very familiar with a lot of different practices and policies around the world. Looking at local, national and international is really the way to make things better for us here. So with that said, I think I just broke the 10-minute barrier there, my apologies, but thanks for your time.
Thank you very
much. Appreciate it.
Any questions or comments? Or yes, great. We might do the collecting again. I know that's hard. Here's a piece of paper and a pen.
All right.
So that at least you hear all the questions.
Yes.
So we'll start on that side.
You behind me. Sorry, Karen.
We'll get both.
Yeah, just like security. Did that come out? Like they're feeling like they're going to be robbed or threatened? Was that?
Don't answer. Next question. Sorry.
Just interested with the 0% felt like it's use of shared cars. Have you then done any further questioning on now that cyclists are allowed to use the footpath, then their accessibility from home simply to the shops, because now it's also the same thing on a general footpath?
Yes.
In terms of cognitive disability, have you thought about toilets, spatial awareness and signage?
Great. Yes.
Comment. I think it's really worth sharing some of the very good redesign that's going on around Perry Lakes, which works incredibly well for people with dementia, both with the access for disability parking and then wayfinding, which needs very little assistance for families or other groups using that space.
I attended a masterclass last week on the smart cities phenomenon in local government and globally, I suppose. And I suppose my question is around how we can use data and technology to find out that information around open space use.
There was one more. Yes.
I was just curious to find out if there was any interest, because we talk about older and younger adults, but what about park space for young families and older adults?
Was there anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, just a quick on the side, I suppose. Last year I'm a landscape architect as well, so last year I was involved with the South Australian Health Department, and they had what they call a D3 challenge, which they do every year. It was actually how to digitally connect the elder population with parks and open spaces. So I sort of touched on something before. So if anybody's interested, just look up the South Australian Health, it's called the D3 challenge. It was how to get people connected to the parks and open space through digital platforms.
Good luck there, Steve. You've got a minute.
Oh dear. Okay, so I'll go backwards, seeing as my recent memory. So I have looked at in the US actually the digital side of things, and there is a lot that we can actually do to reinforce things with older adults. They're a lot cooler than I think we really give credit for, so we can definitely do that. So there was a question up this way on the data and technology with regard to open space use. I've actually looked into that. There's this whole notion of big data, which comes from Facebook and all of those social media outlets. That actually can be used to look at the movement of people, and you have demographic information that accompanies that movement. So you can actually look at that as to how people are using space, at what time of the day, whether it's for events or otherwise, whether in groups or single. So there's lots of opportunities for using all sorts of data towards understanding this notion a little bit further. Perry Lakes design, I live very close to Perry Lakes. I'm very, very aware of it. There should be more places like that. That's the first thing I can say. There was a question about cognitive disability. That is on my list. I have a list about this long of all of these projects that I have to do. I was actually at the University of Tasmania 2 weeks ago talking to some of their specialists down there about this exact thing. So it's begun. Thanks for the thought on that. Footpath use with bikes, scared to death. There's probably a few people I need to be having a very, very stern chat to about this, because what that's going to do is cut down on access and mobility generally, which is not what we want. It's going to take that 30 to 40% and shrink it, which is a big concern. And with regards to security and safety, I can't believe I've actually gotten through this. With regards to security and safety, I was actually shocked that the responses that I had in my surveys and my interviews put security and safety fairly low on the list of concerns for older adults. I would not have picked that at all. But people just weren't worried about that. They were more worried about the conveniences. They were more worried about the feel of community, the retention of natural environment. So,
thank you very much. Well done.